want to welcome each one of you to this study. We are right at the center of this gospel. Today, we are going to look at chapter 11 through 17. It's a big portion, but we'll try and see our effort to get the main message from these chapters. I want to just refresh your memories because we are coming after a week. It is possible that what we discussed in the past, it might have slipped off. You might have forgot. The main thing, as I told you right from class 1, is chapter 1 verses 1 to 18. It's like a foundation to understand the gospel. And even in this study today, we will see how that heart of the prologue, which is chapter 1 verse 12, to all those who believe, Jesus has given them the right to become children of God. So it is about Jesus's divinity. It is about Jesus coming into the world and his own rejecting Jesus. That is what we have seen. And as Pastor has just said, the Cana to Cana section, chapter 2 to 4, there we saw how Jesus supersedes. He brings meaning into the 4 Jewish institutions. Last class, we saw how in Jesus, you see the climax, the goal of Jewish festivals and feasts. We were looking at chapter 5 to 10 in our last week study. And I hope you remember where we ended in chapter 10, because in chapter 9, you see a man born blind, and Pharisees, they were after him. He is unlike the lame man who was healed in chapter 5. Chapter 5 lame man was not a bold witness. Hope you remember those comparisons. Chapter 5 lame man went and spied, and Jesus looked at him and said, if you continue sinning, something worse may happen to you. But in contrast to him, in chapter 9, you see a man born blind progressing in his understanding of who Jesus is. And eventually, he became a bold witness. He, in fact, worshipped Jesus. That is what we see in chapter 9 towards the end. And he is out from his Jewish community in chapter 9, verse 34. And they threw him out, it says, because of his bold witness. He looks at the religious leaders and say, Jesus is from God. Otherwise, nobody can do this. His own parents in chapter 9 and verse 21 and 22, his parents did not believe, did not exercise genuine faith, because parents said they were afraid of Jewish leaders because they'll be put out of synagogue if they take a stand for Jesus. That is when in chapter 10, we see Jesus's presentation of himself as the good shepherd. Good shepherd for whom? For people like this man born blind who took a stand for Jesus. Just like Samaritan woman who was least expected to exercise faith. Nicodemus, we expected him to exercise faith. We expected chapter 3, Nicodemus to understand when Jesus said, unless you're born of water and spirit. But he did not progress in his understanding in chapter 3. But Samaritan woman, she became part of this new messianic community. What I'm trying to say is, to all who believe in the prologue, we are trying to understand that. Who are these people who believed? The unexpected, the marginalized people, Samaritan woman, man born blind, they are the ones who are exercising faith. Now, chapters 11 and 12, we will quickly see 6 things from this 11 and 12, because this 2 chapters serves as a bridge to the rest of the gospel. I hope you all remember the major divisions of this gospel after the prologue. Prologue stands at the beginning, epilogue stands at the end. You have the book of signs, or in other words, the public ministry of Jesus. Public ministry of Jesus is coming to an end. In chapter 11, you see the 7th sign. Public sign is coming to an end. Book of signs or public ministry of Jesus is giving way to private time of Jesus with his disciples. That is what you see from chapter 13 onwards. You will not see crowd there. You will not see any public signs of healing there. You will only see the sign on the cross and resurrection. So chapters 11 and 12, how to look at these two chapters. After Cana to Cana, after Portico to Portico, these two chapters is like a bridge. It's like a transit wherein you move into, from book of signs, you're moving into book of glory, or from signs to passion, from public to private time with his disciples. First observation that I have is, you see how this section, especially chapter 12, ends. Chapter 12:37 is often termed as one of the saddest verse in this particular gospel. Look at chapter 12, verse 37. Even after Jesus had performed so many signs in their presence, they still would not believe in him. See, sometimes, even now, 21st century, I have seen people saying, oh, I really wish the first century days, the signs, if only somebody from the dead was raised. Oh, I cannot imagine the whole village, the whole town would have come to worship Jesus. It is not the case in the first century. In fact, the last sign, the climatic sign of raising of Lazarus, divided people. Some believed, but most of the people got angry with Jesus. Now the first phase of this book is coming to an end, not in a good note, not in a positive note. Jesus performed many signs, 7 signs we know, right from water into wine, and then layman, and then feeding of the 5,000, Jesus walking on water, and man born blind, and all that. 7th sign is raising of Lazarus, but still people would not believe. In other words, science, it's a study in itself. As I told you earlier, most of the signs which were performed in Judea did not result in genuine faith. Chapter 2:23 also we see Jesus performed signs in Judea, but people believed that was superficial belief. Signs are a pointer, but it is limited in its function. That's what we see here in chapter 12:37. Why is Jesus moving to talk to his disciples, the farewell speech, the private time? Because signs had its role. Several people believed, but we see here end of signs and beginning of passion. The transit is, sign has a limited function at the end of the day. It is not yielding everybody to believe in Jesus. Now, when you look at chapter 12:37, what comes to your mind? I hope you are again connecting this 12:37 with chapter 1, verse 10 and 11. This is just a reflection. This is just a commentary on 1, verse 10 and 11. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, with several miracles Jesus had proved himself, but the world did not recognize him. And he came to that which was his own did not receive him. World did not recognize, his own did not receive, and 12:37 is exactly that. Still they would not believe in him. But something very noteworthy here is just previous verses, following verses rather, verse 38, verse 39, 40. When John is writing this, narrating that, many did not believe. You know what he says? This is not accident. This is not that something Jesus has done. Oh, now everything is out of control. We have to think of some other strategy. No. What John is saying is the summary of the public ministry of Jesus, with all these references from Isaiah chapter 53:1 and Isaiah 6:10. Narrator is showing that the Jewish people's rejection of Jesus as Messiah fulfilled scriptural prophecy. So that is not worthy. It is not like signs Jesus performed and now we don't know what is happening. And now, okay, let's move on with the private time with disciples. No. Many did not believe, and that is also fulfilling the prophecy as prophesied by Isaiah in chapter 53:1 and chapter 6, verse 10. The second thing that I want you to see, We are talking about the bridge, the transit. Number one is signs are not yielding into genuine faith. Second thing is the revelation of God's glory in the lifted up of the Son of Man. The revelation of God's glory in the lifted up of Son of Man. You know, three references were there in the first part. I hope you remember. In chapter 3, verse 13, Son of Man will be lifted up. Chapter 8, 28, Son of Man will be lifted up. You see that lifted up expression for the last time here. That is where you know there is a transit happening. From now on, you don't see that. You only see the cross finally lifted up. Jesus lifted up on the cross. 12:32. You see in chapter 12 and verse 32. And when I am lifted up from the earth. So for us who are studying the Gospel of John, when you see in chapter 12:32, lifted up from the earth, we know, okay, this is the last occurrence of this expression which was there in the first half of the Gospel. The third thing, very important thing for us to understand the rest of the Gospel. How is it serving as a transit? When you look at 11 and 12, death of Jesus, the passion of Jesus, looms ever larger in the narrative. What does that mean? In 11 and 12, almost every other accounts in 11 and 12, you see the raising of Lazarus. You see Jesus anointed at Bethany in chapter 12, verse 1 through 11. And then Jesus predicting of death in chapter 12, verse 20 onwards. And Greek people coming to see Jesus, chapter 12, 20. All this, like never before. Till chapter 10, public ministry of Jesus, signs people believed, and Jesus's identity was in question. Those were the major things. People were divided over, he is from Nazareth, he is from Galilee. How can he claim he is Samaritan, he is demon possessed? That was the main conflicts over Jesus's identity was the main theme. But in 11 and 12, something unusual. Every other account is pointing towards the death, resurrection. In fact, raising of Lazarus itself is anticipating resurrection of Jesus. Raising of Lazarus is anticipating the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus' anointing at Bethany, Jesus anointed by Mary, that is also anticipating death and resurrection. Greek people coming to see Jesus. Again, Jesus is saying the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. So these two chapters are loaded with informations about the passion, the death. Death of Jesus looms ever larger in these two chapters. 11:16 is worth noting. 11:16, you remember Thomas's saying when in Judea Jesus was persecuted, and when Jesus said, let's go there to Bethany, to Judea. What is Thomas saying in 11:16? Then Thomas said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. This language is going to be there every now and then in 11 and 12. Let's go die with him. Thomas is saying more than what he knows. Like in 11, the same chapter, 11 verses 49 onwards. This is worth noting, my dear people of God. Look at the way John has arranged these two chapters. It is serving as a bridge, a transition, death to the passion narratives. Look at 11:49 onwards. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die. One man die for the people than the whole nation perish. Caiaphas is saying something more than he knows. John is putting it together in the narrative world. John is arranging it in such a way that the reader is prepared. The public time is over. Now the discussion is about one man will die on behalf of others. Now the discussion is, let us go and die with him. Now the discussion is, the time has come. The hour has finally come, is there in chapter 12, verse 23 for the first time in this narrative. Another thing that I want you to see here in this 11 and 12 is the coming of Greeks to Jesus, which is there in chapter 12, verse 20 onwards. Now, so far what we have seen is end of signs and beginning of passion, revelation of God's glory in the lifting up, saying death of Jesus looms over ever larger in the narrative, and coming of Greeks. Let's see what is happening with the coming of Greeks. Now, if you look at that passage, I will just read a couple of verses. I want you to look at your Bible, chapter 12, verse 20 onwards. Now, there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the festival. They came to Philip. What was their request? They came to Philip because of the name, the accent. They got somehow connected with Philip, and from Bethsaida in Galilee with a request. Sir, they said, we would like to see Jesus. The request is just to see, because they have heard about the miracles. And look at verse 22. Philip went to tell Andrew, and what is Jesus' response? The question is, they want to see you. What is Jesus' response? Jesus replied, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Now, if we are reading that without any background understanding of John, then that comes as a riddle. What is happening? The request of Greek people is, we want to see Jesus. But the response is, it is not like, yeah, please allow them to come and see me. No, that is not the response. The response is not, I want to meet them. No, the response is not, my ministry is successful. The response is, it is time for the Son of Man to be glorified. Why is it very significant in this chapters, in chapter 11 and 12, transit? Why is it important? You know why? What this signifies? What this pericope is? Why is John putting it right here? Because this narrative is talking about the universal benefits of Jesus's death. The universal benefit of Jesus's death. It is not to Jewish people alone. Again, I hope you're keeping one page there, one of your hands there in chapter 1. Greeks coming and Jesus saying, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified, is just an interpretation of 1:12. Yet to all who receive him. How would all come? That is when Jesus is Son of Man has to be glorified. Son of Man has to be lifted up. That is when. So now you know one thing which we are already familiar with, that seeing. When the Greek people said, we want to see Jesus. We know that seeing is more than seeing. It is believing. It is wanting to come into a relationship. Because in chapter 1 itself, we are used to that phrase, come and see. Come and see. It's a universal invitation. Andrew said, come and see. Philip said, come and see. Samaritan woman said, come and see. Now they are coming to see. But Jesus is saying, there is a way. There is a way. When I am lifted up, to all who believe, you can come. That forms the new messianic community. So it's a brilliant transit that you see here. The readers are prepared for passion. The readers are prepared for the death of Jesus, the substitutionary death of Jesus, the ransom which is going to be paid for Greeks to come in. Now, one last observation here with this coming of Greeks. Jesus' public ministry to Israel is complete. By Israel, I mean in the physical, ethnic sense. It is complete. Now, what does it signify? In chapter 10 and verse 16, we have already seen this expression. I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen. So 11 and 12 is giving way from public ministry. Jewish people, some of them believed, not all. Now is the time for Gentiles, other sheep to come in. From 13 onwards, new messianic community, private time to all who believe. Through the death and resurrection of Jesus, they can become part of this new sheep pen. That is the message. In chapter 11, verse 51 and 52 also, there is an expression there. And not only for that nation. You look at verse 52. Does it sounds similar to 10:16. In 10:16, I have other sheep. Now in chapter 11, verse 52, not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God. 11 and 12 is like a bridge. On one side, the public ministry. Second time, you had the private ministry of Jesus. Now, looking at this chapter 11, the miracle itself. Chapter 11, the raising of Lazarus. Raising is the appropriate word to use, not resurrection, because Lazarus died again. And misunderstandings on the part of disciples. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 16, you will see disciples are failing to understand what Jesus is saying, especially about death, and they don't know what they are saying, including Thomas. That theme of misunderstanding, which we are used to from chapter 2 onwards. Destroy this temple, they didn't understand. Water and spirit, Nicodemus did not understand. Living water, Samaritan woman did not understand. Bread, chapter 6:66, they didn't understand. So that theme of misunderstanding is here in chapter 11, verses 1 through 16. And there is one thing that I want to just say here. Especially, I have looked at this verse and I found encouragement. Sometimes we say delays are not denials, all that. Now, in chapter 11, verse 6, what do you see there? 11:6. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And we know on the 4th day. So we look at it and get encouraged. That is okay. But I want you to know, there is something more than just delays are not denials. There is something more than Mary, Martha, oh, they lost their brother. What if Lazarus is not raised? Then they will be abandoned. That is not the point here. Maybe on one layer you see Jesus had compassion, and especially Mary, Martha opened their house for Jesus, and Jesus is delaying, but at the end he is showing up and glory is revealed in 11:4. God's glory is revealed. But something more is there, because in their understanding, the spirit of the departed was there hovering around the body for 3 days in the hope of resuscitation. That is the backdrop. That is why this denial. Why is John putting it here? Because there is an understanding that for 3 days, the spirit of the departed is hovering in the hope of resuscitation. There will be an awakening, a bringing back of life. How is Jesus presented here? In chapter 5, in chapter 1, he alone can give life. That is the point here. The sign is not just Mary and Martha's tears are wiped off. It is a sign. Lazarus will die again. Sometimes I see believers, we sometimes believe things by picking up verses and find ourselves in big trouble, especially when it comes to something like this. I don't want to elaborate that too much, but I want us to know that these are signs. What is this pointing to? Jesus can give life. And this is an object lesson for disciples. That is how I look at it. Mary, Martha on one side, but this is an object lesson for disciples. If you follow me, if you are part of this messianic community, if you are out of the temple, if you're out of the social gatherings of Jewish people, don't worry. I will raise you up on the last day. That is the message here. You are following God. That is the message here. It is not just the domesticated understanding of what will I get. That is not the thing. There is something bigger happening here. And that 4 days, it is good to read verse 17, 11:17. It says it's been 4 days, and Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. And for the readers, wow, Jesus can do this. He is the one who gives life. That is what they will get. Then Jesus will be there for my problem. If I open doors of my house for Jesus, then nothing will go wrong. There are people who read that here. In Luke's Gospel 10, in Bethany, Mary, Martha opened their door. And if you open your door for Jesus, then nothing will go wrong. Jesus will show up. We cannot expect this every other time, but we can all expect it at the last day. On that day, resurrection is there. That is the message of this. Okay. In chapter 12, I want you to see something very interesting. After this, maybe one more observation in chapter 11, and then we will move to chapter 12, because that's very interesting how Martha is characterized in this whole narrative. How is Martha characterized? Is there some, like in John's Gospel, or for that matter, in any other Matthew, Mark, and Luke, character studies are very interesting. Narrator's presentation of a character. Martha is presented as in, look at verse 20, chapter 11, verse 20. She is presented as the one who went out to meet. And narrator deliberately says something there. You know what he says? She went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. That is interesting about the characterization of Martha. She is outgoing. Mary is reserved, but Martha goes out to meet. And then what happens? In verse 21, she expresses disappointment. So she is not an ideal disciple there. She goes out, but she did not understand it fully. Just like Mary. Mary also expressed the same thing. If you would have been here later on, Mary also say the same thing. If you would have been here, it would not have happened. So Martha is not present as somebody who understood everything, no, but she went out. The third thing that you see about Martha is she does not understand, or grasp that immediate significance of Jesus's atonement. In verse 23, your brother will rise again, Jesus says. And when we look at that verse 24, Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. She has some understanding, but it is not fully developed, fully formed. She went out, that is true, but expresses disappointment. But progresses like she is active. She is active. My dear brothers and sisters, we may not be overnight, getting a grasp of everything, what God does in us or what God, do in us in our lives. But Martha is a good example, I thought. She went out, she is active, and she expresses her views. And then what happens in verse 27? 27 is very important. How is Martha presented? Look at verse 27. Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. I was overjoyed when I read verse 27. Yes, Lord, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Anybody remember these two terms, Messiah, Son of God? This is the purpose statement, isn't it? In John's Gospel, chapter 20, this is what the narrator has said. These things are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Martha is now like a model disciple. She had her shares of struggles. This is exactly what Paul said in Philippians. He who began a good work in you. Some of us are ahead, some of us are behind, but don't stop learning, because disciple, the word disciple means not follower, learner. Sometimes popularly we say disciple is a follower. Disciple, the word disciple means learner, an active student. Martha went out, expressed disappointment, and did not understand, grasp it fully. But now, in verse 27, I believe that you are the Messiah. You are the Son of God. This is purpose statement coming from Martha's mouth. She is a model disciple there. Oh, and one more thing. How can we miss it? Because we have seen it in chapter 1 itself. There is something about disciples. in John's gospel. Andrew could not keep this news to himself. Philip could not keep the news of who Jesus is to himself. Samaritan woman could not keep it to herself. She ran and went and told her people. What do you see here? In verse 28, after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. She is like in that company of Philip, of Andrew, of Samaritan woman. Martha is, as I told you in our previous session several times, it is one thing to study this for the sake of study. Okay, there is 11 and 12 is a transit. That is good. Okay, to passion. I know that 6 points. That is one thing. That is important. But don't stop there. There is a challenge coming from Martha to each one of us. In the next chapter, we are going to see how Mary is going to challenge us, both these sisters, all the women out there who are listening to me. John's gospel has an interesting way of presenting these women characters as model disciples. Samaritan woman is one. They're not stopping witnessing. They progress in their understanding and they ran to their people. May you take up that challenge in the next couple of days before the next Sunday. Tell this good news to somebody. Invite one person to the service next Sunday. That will be kind of a fruit that would come out of this Thursday Bible studies. Next Sunday service, if you can call one person, come and just attend our service. YouTube link you share and expect God to touch them. That is what Martha does. That is what Philip did. That is what Andrew did. That's what Samaritan woman did. Okay, moving on. There is something in chapter 12 which is kind of putting in front of our eyes. What company are we part of? There are two characters here. I'm looking at chapter 12, verses 1 onwards. On one side, you have Mary. On other side, you have Judas, one of the 12. And the way John, the narrator, contrasts both these characters. In fact, the whole point, if you look at it carefully, around 1 or 2 verses is there for Mary, but around 5 verses are about Judas. So that is, again, something that we should not miss. Judas being part of the company, and in Matthew's Gospel 10, when Jesus sent his people out, Judas is also part of that gang. Judas also prayed over people, they got healed. Judas also might have definitely preached. But look at the way these two are in two different parts altogether, trajectory altogether. One as a model disciple, one as somebody whom we should not try to imitate, run away. We'll see that in a while. Mary, what does she represent? Mary observes that anointing. If you look at verse 3, Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus. What is this? This is anticipating Jesus's burial. Expensive worship. Not over. This is also like a prophetic manner. We are familiar with that. Jesus went into the temple, a prophetic sign, just like that. Or just like Lazarus raised. It's also like looking forward, prophetic sign like that. Here also you see that anointing. And what is Mary doing with this expensive thing here? Because narrator is very particular, he says, an expensive perfume. What is Mary doing? Designating Jesus as the royal Messiah. That is what Mary does. For Mary, Jesus is the king. Are you familiar with that word somewhere? People expected him to be a king. I hope some of you will remember. It was in chapter 6 and verse 15, right after the feeding of the 5,000. In 14, they said, is this a prophet? In verse 15, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, they wanted a king who can provide for them, who is like a superman, overthrowing the Roman government. But for Mary, she truly understood who Jesus is, and an expensive worship, confessing, declaring the royal Messiah. Woman exemplifies unselfish and devoted discipleship to Jesus, in contrast to Judas's self-seeking mode of operation. How much we have to be careful. I cannot stress this enough. No, being a teacher, a preacher, Judas was very close to Jesus. But he is the one who turns out to be the phrases used in chapter 3, verse 2 about Judas, and later on also. He almost became like an embodiment of the devil in John's gospel. And Mary, on the other side, selfless, unselfish devotion. One more thing that you see in this narrative, this Mary's act of love, it anticipates another act of love. You know what it is? That of Jesus himself in the next chapter. Foot washing. Foot washing. Mary is Christ-like in this posture and action. In the next chapter, you see Jesus washing the feet of disciples. Now, Mary here, the anointing of Mary. This is anticipating Jesus. Okay, so chapter 11, it was Martha. Chapter 11, it was Martha. So let's not conclude when we look at chapter 11, verse 20. Martha heard that Jesus was. She went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Oh, Mary is less compared to. No. Martha progressed in her understanding and confessed, you are the Messiah, son of. Now, Mary, the narrator presents her as the one who is an ideal model disciple, imitating Jesus. But how will I just leave that without talking a couple of more things about Judas? Listen to me carefully. The narrator has already given us an information in chapter 6 and verse 70, 71, already prepared us that there are surprises on our way. Not everybody who professes themselves to be disciples are not going to be disciples. In 6:70, have I not chosen you the 12? Yet one of you is a devil, and there is an aside there in brackets in verse 70. He meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Already we are prepared for this. But I want you to see a word used that caught my attention, that is worth noting. Look at chapter 12, verse 6. There are two things that I want you to see there. Two words used here. He did not say this. What did he say? Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. Why this concern? And he did not say this because he cared about the poor. Let me stop there. Why this? Why is John saying? Why John the narrator is saying? He did not care this because he cared for the poor. I want you to know somewhere along the way, in this 2 to 3 years, among the 12, maybe because he had the money with him, somehow he had the outlook of somebody who was for the poor. How do I know that? Look at chapter 13, the next chapter. When he went out to betray Jesus, you know what people thought? Chapter 13, verse 29. Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Judas has done enough to make others think about him this way. Some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor. Mary is an ordinary believer. Judas has this reputation of somebody who is for the poor. 13:29 also. One more thing in verse 6 we should not miss. He did not care for the poor, but because he was a thief. The only other place where you see this word mentioned in this gospel, I am sure some of you will be able to guess it already. Because he was a thief. Where did we see this? In chapter 10, verse 1, chapter 10, verse 8, chapter 10, verse 10, thief. Who were those thieves? I told you chapter 10 has to be interpreted in the light of 9. 9 ending with false shepherds, religious leaders. Now, John the narrator is saying he did not tell this because he loved the poor, because he was a thief. What is John trying to say? Here is an example of somebody who is represented in chapter 10, false shepherd. Out of the 12, one emerging to be a false shepherd. Unbelievable. Because this in chapter 10 and verse 10, thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. Who is this thief? Now it is Judas, because he is a thief in chapter 12 and verse 6. He is a false shepherd. Though he is chosen, though he was with Jesus, though he has done miracles, on one side Mary is model disciple, on one side Judas is a false shepherd. And what is interesting is that word thief is not there in synoptics, the way they characterized Judas in this narrative. That is what it will just make us come alive. Why is he characterized as thief here in 12:6 and connection with chapter 10? Okay, let's move on. Chapter 13 is an important chapter, the foot washing. What are the lessons that we must learn there? At least there are 3 things, very important 3 things. Number 1, there's an interesting phrase there in verse 4 and verse 12. Let me read first of all verse 4. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and in verse 12, I want you to mark that word, took off. And in verse 12, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on. Hope all of you have noted that. Verse 4, he took off. Verse 12, he put on. When you look at the original language, you're blown away, because there is a similarity that you see. These words, a similarity with chapter 10, verse 17 and 18. What is there in chapter 10, verse 17 and 18? What is this washing of the feet representing symbolically? Chapter 10, verse 17 and 18. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. Took off is equal to lay down. Put on is equal to take up. This is again anticipating, just like what Jesus is doing here. He is in control of that passion. He is in control. He is the one who is going to lay his life and take it up again. Just like these words represent in 13:4. He took off and he put on. Other than the symbolic representation, is there anything more? Of course. Especially chapter 13, verse 13 to 16 talks about literally, physically what has happened. Jesus's humility and servanthood. Because this duty was carried out by slaves. The moment you're washing feet of somebody, you're considering others better. You are identifying yourself as a slave, a servant. And Jesus has exactly told that. Verse 15, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done to you. And very truly, verse 16, very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master. Now in this episode, Jesus is the servant. Jesus is the servant. That's interesting. In this episode, Jesus is the servant washing the feet of disciples. But when he is explaining it, he is saying, no servant is greater than his master. Meaning you should do the same thing. You are not greater than me, disciples. That is the message there. In Philippians chapter 2, consider others better, have the same attitude of Christ. That is also there in this washing of feet. So a symbolic representation of Jesus' death, resurrection. Also literally, physically, it talks about the humility, servanthood. And also when we look back, we are reminded of what Mary has done. And also it stands as in a figurative way, especially verse 18 following. The removal of betrayal, cleansing in a figurative way. Not everyone is clean. Look at verse 10. When Peter had preserved not just my feet, but my hands, and Jesus said, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you. And who is that? Not every one of you. Chapter 13, 18 onwards. In a figurative way, there is cleansing happening here. Judas is out. Judas is out. And chapter 13, verse 18 onwards. If any of you are interested to study more on Judas as a character, it is worth studying. And you just need to type Judas, sermon on Judas, City Harvest AG Church. You will get a sermon just on Judas. And some of these passages are explained there. Just two things I'll say there. First is the height of hypocrisy, which Judas represented. Because nobody knew. Everybody was looking at each other. When Jesus said, now one of you will betray me. Nobody knew it was Judas. Everybody was not looking at Judas and, yeah, it is you, it is you. No, because he had a good outlook of a servant of God, somebody who is concerned of poor. And another thing that I want you to note is verse 30. This cleansing happens, and there is a comment there in verse 30. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out. And something very interesting, in chapter 13, verse 2, devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray. Meal was in progress. Devil had already prompted, and now it progressed, and it is here now. He went out. I thought the narrator will stop there. He went out, cleansed. New messianic community. Judas is gone. People like Mary, Martha are in. No, narrator is not stopping there. He just has another explanation there, John. And it was night. And it was night. It is a symbolic way of saying he is a character of the night. Night is where you stumble, Jesus says. In chapter 11, Jesus has told, as long as it is day, you look at chapter 11, verse 9. Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. In chapter 3, this is used in ethical matters. Darkness, light. Nicodemus came to Jesus, it was night, but he moved from night to day. Later on, we'll see that in when we come to chapter 18, 19. But Judas Just like what I told you about chapter 12, verse 27, it's a sad verse. Jesus performed many signs, but people did not believe. This is also a sad verse. He went out and it was night. In other words, if I may paraphrase that, it was night. He loved darkness. He went into the night. From where? From where? From the light of the world. From Jesus himself, who is the epitome of moral conduct, who came to exegete how God looks like. He was with the light of the world 3 years, and he went out and it was night. He stumbles. He disintegrates himself. He becomes like a devil himself, just like in Synoptic Gospel. Get behind me, Satan, to Peter. He is more than that. Devil entered him and he acts like the way devil would want him to do. Moving on, there is one more thing that we will look at and we will wind up for the day. Chapter 13, verses 31 to 34. I'll just focus on that verse 34. Now, many people have observed this. Wow, it really has to be done this way, isn't it? There was a cleansing in the new Messianic community, and the greatest command is given to them. For miracles, there was no cleansing. They were all together. Now, this is going to be, chapter 13, 31 onwards is going to be like a foundation for the new Messianic community. And the betrayer is out. He is cleansed. Jesus cleansed the Messianic community. He's out. We went out, it was night, and in 13:34, a new command I give you. The question is, what is new about this new command? Is there in Leviticus? It was there in the Old Testament scriptures. Love one another. What is new about this new command? At least there are 3 things that you see that makes it new. Number 1, the standard of love. In the Old Testament, it was love one another as yourself. I want you to see something very interesting in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5. When Jesus referred to that, you know what did he say? Look at chapter 5, verse 43. Coming from Leviticus 19:18. Jesus is saying, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor. But there is something more there in Leviticus 19:18. Love your neighbor as yourself. That they dropped it. Who? Pharisees and scribes. Jesus is quoting how it was known to them in first century. And they added also. Pharisees and scribes added something. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Hate your neighbor, hate your enemy is not there in Leviticus 19. This is a quotation from Leviticus 19:18, but they have altered it. Pharisees and scribes, just like Matthew's Gospel 5, verse 19, Jesus says, therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands, they literally played, distorted with that command. Love your neighbor as yourself is gone. And hate your enemy is added. As people have said, how to love has become whom to love. In Pharisees' interpretation, how to love, standard of loving has become whom to love. That is when Jesus is in that backdrop. Jesus is saying, a new command I give you. Love your neighbor, not as yourself. Look at that. Love one another. Is not as yourself. As yourself itself is altered. What Jesus is saying, standard of living, standard of love is not as yourself. Love one another as I have loved you. The selfless, the sacrificial, cross-like. That's what we see in chapter 15 about the fruit. This is the fruit of abiding relationship. Love. Just like Jesus loved. Disciples also will love one another. That is the fruit in chapter 15. Standard of love is changed. That is how a new command I give you. It is there in the Old Testament, but it is new because standard is new. And disciples are supposed to imitate this in chapter 13, verse 14, 15, 17, 18. And they prove their status as true disciples by loving. No, look at 13:35. This is what it makes. This is what makes this new. Standard is new. And who is the member of the Messianic community? Verse 35. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples. Not by dietary laws, not by circumcision, not by anything. This is how Messianic community is identified by this one particular aspect. But by this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. And Jesus repeats this command in chapter 15, verse 12, as the fruit of abiding, remaining. 15, verse 12. I'll just read 15:12. My command is this: love each other as I have loved. New standard. And by the way, in letters of John also, same author in 2 John 5 emphasizes the same. 1 John 3:11, loving one another as the sign of somebody who belongs to this new Messianic community. Dear brothers and sisters, 11 and 12, as we have seen, is preparing us for passion, preparing us for book of glory, the substitutionary death of Jesus, where all can come. Greeks came to see Jesus, and Jesus is saying, time has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And we have seen Martha, we have seen Mary, we have seen Judas, we have seen the foot washing, and we have seen the new command. May God help all of us, not just to understand it in our minds, but also let our hearts be transformed by this. May God help us to obey this in the days to come.